This week, hey, welcome again. This week, we're going to be talking about project-based learning, or PBL for short. My name is Kim Loomis, and I'll be hosting tonight's webinar. This is, I think, number 5 of our student-centered series. We'll have one more. I think that's the 5 E's that are coming up later in the month of June, and we have one more blended learning series, which will come up shortly, also in early June. Again, my name is Kim Loomis. I was the director for online and blended learning in Clark County School District. I did retire in the summer of 2019, just prior to COVID. So I didn't have to deal with all of the stuff that you guys have been dealing with. But I will tell you, my heart aches because that is the stuff I love. When they retire, they tell you go follow your passion. And so I've been able to do that by actually continuing with professional development and working with a bunch of schools across the nation, putting together online and blended programs. I did write a book. It's called Think Outside the Box, the CIA of Blended and 10 plus models for secondary schools. We'll talk a little bit about the CIA, I think, next week. This week, we'll just hit some definitions. But my background is I was a 10-year high school math teacher, and then I worked for RPDP for a short period stint. I was a curriculum coordinator. I did high school reform. I was an administrator at the Nevada Learning Academy. And just I've had a really great stint, but I have been in the online and blended world for over 20 years, and I can't get enough of it, that's for sure. Today, we're going to be talking about project-based learning. So we'll start with a little bit talking about what does student-centered learning look like, because that's our absolute goal, is to look at what student-centered looks like, and then how can we use a pedagogy called project-based learning to get students to own their own learning and to release that learning to our students. And then we'll talk about elements of it. And as you heard just a moment ago, somebody asked about our Canvas Extended workshop. If you like what you hear today and it's something you want to take back to your classroom and try to implement, I know school's kind of close and everything's kind of coming down to a wire, but if you do that, you can get an additional 5 hours of professional learning credits. Today, you'll get the hour for the webinar, but everybody is already enrolled in the Canvas course, so you can just audit it. You can go in, you can go look all the cool stuff, or you can try to implement it as well. So let's talk a little bit about the core business of schools, because this is Kim Loomis's definition. I truly believe that the core business of schools is relationships and learning. And I believe in that hierarchy. I believe that part of school is relationships with adults as well as their peers. So we want to make sure that we're setting those types of learning environments up so that kids are creating relationships with adults and peers. And it's really easy to do if we do some of that teaching by walking around, and we'll talk more about that today. And then, of course, learning. And I'm not saying that learning is secondary. It's also a big part of what we do here, but you know that relationships have to come first. I always say that I taught high school math for 10 years, and I will tell you, I had kids that failed my class in spite of Miss Loomis, because they were just going to show me how I was such a bad teacher by failing my course. So hard and heartbreaking, as you know. When we talk about blended personalized learning, you notice that I don't just say blended learning, I also say personalized learning, because what I truly believe is that when we blend learning, we have this great opportunity to personalize it. So what we want to do is, like I said, I was a high school math teacher for 10 years. So I truly believe that we got this real simple equation. We can take the wisdom of the teachers, because you guys are super smart. Not only did you get a bachelor's degree before you became a teacher, but some of you have master's degrees and you've done plenty of workshops, much like this one. So we take that wisdom, and you also know your kids inside and out. And that's a wisdom that a computer would never know. So you have this heart, this caring relationships with kids. And I never, ever want to take the teacher out of the classroom. But what we do have is we have this great opportunity with the adaptability of technology, where we can create personalized learning spaces so that Patricia can be at a different place that Amy's at, that Michael's at, inside of a software program. And we can be learning the same concepts, be at different places at different times. And that creates that personalized learning space for each and every individual student. So you'll notice the 3 icons here: the teacher, the technology, and the student. So when I talk a lot about the CIA, or the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, that's really what I'm talking about. I am saying that 1/3 of the time you should release the learning to the technology. And when I say that is, you should have digital partners like Khan Academy or CK12, or a bot product like Apex or iReady or Alex Math, where you can release the DOK, the low level learning to, so that you can do that teaching by walking around. And that's where we build our relationships. And a third of the time, and this is where we're going to spend a lot of time tonight, is releasing to our students, where they're driving their learning. They're working through some content and creating some ownership of that learning. And again, this opportunity for us to do some teaching by walking around. And a third of the time where we can guide with small groups, and we can do direct instruction, Socratic seminars. So you notice here the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. The hardest part for teachers is the 2/3 of teaching by walking around. So when we release to the digital content and we'll release to our students, that's 2/3 of the time in any, not day, but any unit of study that I am releasing the learning either to the technology or to the students. So that's probably the hardest part, because we're such control. We want to have so much control. But when we do that, we get to build those relationships that are so important that we were just talking about as the core business of schools. So this requires a shift in our instruction. So prior to COVID, I know COVID made a lot of changes in our lives, but prior to COVID, we had a lot of teacher-led direct instruction where we did most of the work and the students displayed evidence of engagement. You know, they did what we asked them to. Well, what we want to do is we want to change that slowly so that now we're facilitating. And COVID gave us that opportunity, because with COVID, we were able to create one-on-one learning environments. We were able to put Chromebooks in every student's hand, which meant that no longer did I have to worry if every kid had a computer, because now I know they do. The question is, did they actually bring it charged to school, right? But it shifts our instruction. What it does is it helps us to facilitate that teaching by walking around, where we're guiding the learning. Oh, I had a great one this morning. I was reading some of your guys' write-ups from last week when we did the data tools. And, you know, one of the tools that was used was booklet. And it was great because, you know, the teacher's walking around, and if the kid got it right, there's this nice green square screen that comes on. And if the student got it wrong, there was a red square. So that teaching by walking around gives us not only the ability to build relationships, but it also gives us that ability to monitor the student learning, because the students start experimenting with ownership, because they're going to be at different places at different times. Even if they're in a Khan Academy or even in your Canvas course, one might be watching a video, another might be on a Google Doc. So it's more of a facilitation in that stage too. Now, what we're going to shoot for, not today, not tomorrow, but somewhere down the line, we're going to shoot for that co-facilitation, where we're really what I would call the lead learner, and we're all learning together. And this is where the students truly take ownership of their learning. If you get a chance, I would highly suggest going back and looking at the learner profile webinar that we did earlier in the year. That's a great opportunity for students to start taking ownership and understanding their role in learning. That's a great place to start. So today, when we talk about PBL, we're kind of between stages 2 and 3. So when we move forward here, you'll start seeing us releasing that learning. And when we release that learning, you can see, and this image here is in our Canvas course, so you have an opportunity. You don't have to write all this down. A vast majority of the slides here today will be in the Canvas course as well, even if you're auditing or if you're going through the course for the additional 5 hours. But when we make this role change, and if I look at the role change, it's the third one down there. Instead of us being the authoritarian and the leader, what we're going to be is the lead learner, like the facilitator, the learning partner, that teaching by walking around. And instead of us providing all of the knowledge and they're taking notes drastically on it, what we want them to do is we want them to construct knowledge. And today, when we talk about PBL, they're truly constructing knowledge. And it could be done in a review situation, or it could be done with brand new material. But our key here is to get them actively engaged in owning that learning, instead of sitting back and being that passive receiver. And it creates a more collaborative, supportive environment versus the competitive, who got the highest score, you know, individualistic environment that we tend to have in our teacher-centered areas. So as we think through that change and that emphasis, and you'll notice if you get that about fourth one down, our instructional emphasis is going to definitely change, especially as we're looking for PBL, is we're going to be asking some really open-ended questions and asking our students to probe into those and research those and actually learn from errors. I like to say that when you fail, that's just your first attempt at learning, so that they get more opportunities to try to learn again and again and again. So this change to the student-centered learning does have a little bit of shift, not only in our thinking, but also in our students' thinking. So instead of being those passive consumers, they now have to be active agents. And you'll see that when we talk about PBL, because we're not going to just open, a base of knowledge and pour it into their heads. They're actually going to have to make some decisions. They're going to have to create. They're going to have to collaborate. They're going to make those shifts from that fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And what that does is that allows them to take ownership of their own learning. And when they do that, they're building skills for the future, guys. Those soft skills that we talk about that everybody wants the kids to have, they can't have them if we're always telling students what to do. But when we step back 2/3 of the time and let the technology and let the students lead, there's an opportunity for them to take ownership and build some of those growth mindsets that we want them to have, like persistence, like grit, like leadership, all those things that would be important. So what we're going to do right now, and I know it's early in our sessions, but we're going to go into a breakout room. What I want you guys to think about is when we go into PBLs, I want you to start thinking about how do you help students understand their responsibility in learning. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. I know that was a quick 5 minutes. And if you have anything you want to share and you want to go ahead and throw it up in chat, something that came up in your room that it's like, oh my gosh, I got to share this with everybody, please feel comfortable. That's what the chat's there for you guys to be able to do that as well. So when you think about releasing the learning to our students, we have to help them with that responsibility. Sometimes it's a slow release. Sometimes now towards the end of the school year, you might have a little different what that might look like than at the beginning of the year. So let's talk a little bit about project-based learning, because really what we're talking about here is constructivist. I'm a big Dewey fan, so this is like so exciting for me. Inquiry-based, it's really student-centered, projects where the kids come in and they take control of it. And it's really sometimes hard to do that release to students if we haven't built up that trust with them. And so it becomes really important, like we talked about a moment ago, relationships before learning, right? So when we think about this pedagogy shift to project-based learning and using projects and releasing the learning to our students, we're going to move off of that traditional where it's I tell the kids what they need to know, they memorize it, and basically they spit it back out, right? They demonstrate mastery of it. But what we want to do is in project-based learning or in this inquiry, constructivist mode, what we really want to do is we want to have open-ended questions that drive the learning. I know we've oftentimes called them essential questions, but we want to make sure they're wide and they're open. And that way the students and yourself working together to identify and seek what they need to know to answer this big open-ended question. Then they can work together in collaborative arenas and learn and apply that new knowledge by doing some form of a project. And ideally, this is the way I think about it. If you get your project looks the same, every 30 kids turn in the exact same project, then it wasn't a project. It was a recipe. They just did what you told them to do. But when we think about project-based learning, we really think that that project should look different from different people because they've had different learnings. So it might be, designing a house, it might be doing a restaurant menu, and you'll see some of these examples in our Canvas course, but they're all a little bit different, right? So when we think about basic steps to extending the learning, and that's what really projects are, is we're extending that learning. So we want to start with some open-ended questions. We want to think about, how do I ask this question so it's not Googleable, right? So that they can go out and do some research and synthesize and get to that top part of the Bloom's taxonomy where they're really synthesizing and creating and collaborating and really designing their own knowledge. We're not giving them the knowledge, but they're designing it. So that's where they're doing that research and they're sharing what they've learned in small groups. Like here you see three students working together. And then the key here is not only just finish the project, but to reflect on that learning, and you're going to see a little bit later, we're going to talk about this G.R.I.T rubric, and it's also in our Canvas course, where students are really evaluating their own learning process, not just what did they learn, but what processes did they go through that they can use the next time around when they're learning. So at this time, what I really want you to do is I want you to go back into your breakout rooms and I want you to share about a project you've used in your learning to extend the students' knowledge. Welcome back, everybody. I saw that there's a great placement there in the chat. You might want to check that out from Phoenix, talking about students' resistance. Yeah, I think that coming back from pandemic has really kind of made it a little bit tough. When we did choice boards, I tried to tell you guys 2 is a choice. So keep that in mind as well. But yeah, definitely. Hopefully you had some good conversations on there about some projects that you've done to extend the learning. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what is project-based learning. So when we talk about project-based learning, I will tell you the lead gold standard comes from PBLworks.com. So they have a short little video here. It's like 3.5 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and show it to us so that we get a better understanding. I won't be having to explain it. I'm going to release the learning actually to this video from.
You remember what it was like in school. It was boring. You sat in class, memorized as much as you could, and tried to pass a test at the end. But is that good enough? These days, school can be more interesting and effective by focusing students on work that matters. This is project-based learning explained. Most adults live in a world of projects. Whether it's a job assignment, home improvement, or planning a wedding, we need to actively solve problems. But unfortunately, schoolwork looks more like this than this. Let's take a look at this project-based world. Meet Claire. She was recently presented with a challenge. Her company, Super Suds, makes soap, and it was up to her to find the most earth-friendly way to produce it in the future. Her boss gave her a budget and a few requirements, and it was up to her to come up with a solution. She organized and managed a team who researched the options and created materials summarizing the issues. Claire's team asked for feedback and presented their findings to the boss. Claire came out of the project looking like a rock star, and she learned a lot about green products. If you look closely, Claire's success involved critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, things that aren't often taught in traditional classrooms. The world needs more Claires, so how do we get them? The answer is project-based learning, or PBL. By focusing students on a project, teachers put them on a path that deepens their knowledge and builds skills they'll need in the future. Here's what I mean. Mr. Simmons has always been a good science teacher, and his students do well on Friday's tests. Unfortunately, what they learned was gone by Saturday morning. That wasn't good enough for him. Soon he learned about project-based learning and decided to give it a shot. Mr. Simmons got the idea for his first project on microorganisms when nearly half of his students were suddenly absent with the flu. He asked his students why they thought so many of their classmates got sick at the same time. That lively discussion produced a lot of good questions and a list of things the kids wanted to know. Mr. Simmons then announced their project was to help elementary school kids understand, how can we not get sick? After dividing the class into teams, he got them started on the project. It was up to the students to ask questions, research, collaborate, give each other feedback, and figure out the best ways to make their points clear to children. One team chose to make an educational video on the connection between hand washing and avoiding the flu. Another chose to create posters to show how viruses spread. The project teams showed off their final work to an enthusiastic audience of parents and their children at a nearby elementary school. Sitting in the front row was our good friend and local rock star Claire, who saw a bit of herself in the students. It was clear that the project was a success for the students, the audience, and Mr. Simmons. His students practiced critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. The project wasn't about memorization, but learning in depth about viruses and how to prevent spreading disease, a lesson they will never forget. At the end of the presentation, Claire introduced herself to the students and told them that they were rock stars and that the world needs more people who can think like them.
here, what I did is I released the learning actually to digital content. But like you saw in the video, we live in a project-based world. Me designing this webinar and putting the things together in our workshop inside of the Canvas course, that's a project, right? So our whole lives are based on projects that we do. But if we don't give our kids those opportunities to communicate, collaborate, and critically think, then we're doing a disservice to them. So it's really important that when we think about project-based learning, that we're looking at ways that we can extend the learning. Now, here's two different definitions of project-based learning. One comes from PBL Works, one comes from ISTE. And you'll notice that both of them are talking about open-ended questions, applying their knowledge, producing authentic products, lively, engaging real-world learning, right? It's really hard to wrap your mind around what is project-based learning when it's really constructivism. When you really think about the Dewey, philosophy of education and the inquiry philosophy, that's really what we're getting to, is we're trying to get our students to own their learning. And that's why we started today with student-centered learning and helping them understand what is it mean to own their learning. Because here's the key, right? Unlike the Bloom's taxonomy bottom of the pyramid that we want our kids to get up to the top, in this one, I want them to do more than the reading at the top and the hearing at the top. I really want them to get down to the bottom of this pyramid from Edgar Dale, where it says that we will remember more of what we say and what we do. That bottom of the pyramid is where we will have our kids get a better understanding of their concepts. So even if they're not presenting to the whole class, because I know sometimes that's very difficult, having them, pair up and two groups present to each other so that they get to say it, they get to do it, they get to remember the work that they've been engaged in, going beyond that reading and hearing and seeing. So when we think of PBL Works, this is their PBL standard. They're saying if you're going to do a quality project, these are the 7 elements that you need. You need to have a challenging problem or a question, have sustained inquiry. So the kids are constantly looking, they're asking more questions, delving deeper into the product, and really getting some authenticity, meaning that, it's something that they want to know more about, something that's in their world. And ideally, if we can set up choice, and that's nice that some of us have already done the choice boards and the choice menus, if there was a way for us to give them choice, as you saw in the video, some kids created their own videos, some created posters, some created, brochures. So that's the key with that project-based learning, is we're not getting one thing, we're getting a variety of things back. But the bottom part here is just as important, that reflection on their learning. What did you do? What did you as a learner do to get to this stage? And then having them critique not only themselves, but each other, so that they can revise their projects just like we do as adults. We don't just say, oh, here's my end product. Heck, our bosses come back to us and say, I need you to revise this, right? So they get a little bit of feedback, have some revision, and then they can produce a product that they feel that is publicly displayable. Or in this case, we can share within groups, or we can share to the whole class. This is the gold standard. I'm not saying it's the standard that we're all going to hit today or tomorrow, but it's somewhere down the line where this is what we're looking for. There are 3 different types of methods of making this happen. We can do it as a teacher-driven structured inquiry, where we throw out the questions and we throw out the activities and the kids get through it. We could set it up as a guided inquiry where we initiate it, like we throw out some questions, and then we think about some possible activities for the students to do. They have some choices of those activities that they can do. Their end product might be a choice, or we can have a full-blown, depending on where you are in your use of project-based learning, if you want to do a full inquiry, where the students set up their own questions. You've probably seen those passion projects. That is definitely a project where the kids say, I want to learn more about camping, or I really love soccer, I want to know the history of soccer, where they're throwing out their own questions and doing an open inquiry. So as you're going through this and you're thinking, well, what type of project do I want? Find a place where you're most comfortable. Don't feel like you have to hit the gold standard and hit everywhere that's out there. But as you're going through the project, what you want to do is make sure that you're hitting the 4 C's. Now, our next webinar workshop is deep into the 4 C's, but this time you want to make sure that when you're doing your projects, there is some way where kids are sharing their thoughts and questions and ideas, right? And where they're collaborating with each other, reaching a goal, putting their expertise together and working smarter, not harder. And ideally, we definitely want them to get to that critical thinking where they're doing innovative, different thinking and posing more questions and really thinking about how things can be done in a different cross-discipline way. So those are some ways when you're thinking about putting your project together, how can I make it a 4 C's? To me, it goes right back to relationships and learning. Kids come to school to have relationships with each other as well. So we want to make sure that we have small group projects, even pairs or threes, something that can keep them together so that they are really communicating, collaborating, creating, something that makes them really think critically. So again, inside the Canvas course, if you go to PBL Works, they have a lot of projects that are already done for us. So you might find one that can help you wrap up the end of the year, review something that you guys learned already, but what you're going to find, it's got a driving question. It's going to have some inquiry and some innovation in it. And again, like we talked about, we are building those soft skills, those 21st century skills, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. But there is a whole library of projects that you guys can look through, and you can see if there's one there that you might want to pull out. Now let's listen to John Spencer. I'm sure that some of you have seen John Spencer. He's got this cool project-based thing that he does. It's called the launch cycle.
What happens when teachers design projects that empower students with voice and choice? Students embrace a maker mindset. They define themselves as inventors and creators. They learn to take creative risks. Here they experiment and engage in iterative thinking. When this happens, they embrace a growth mindset and grow resilient. They become problem solvers and systems thinkers. They become divergent thinkers, thinking outside the box. They'll use creative constraint to find original uses for materials. Here they discover it's okay to be different. Often students embrace curiosity and wonder. They become explorers, seeking out new information and thinking critically. They grow more empathetic as they design meaningful products that they launch to the world. On an academic level, students are more engaged and the information sticks. There's often an increase in student achievement. Meanwhile, they learn key skills like project management, collaboration, and communication. True, these projects will prepare students for the creative economy, but more importantly, they empower students for a creative life. Here they see that making is magic. We know that there's a time crunch in schools. Materials can be scarce. Sometimes you're stuck with a tight curriculum map. But when you, as a teacher, empower your students with voice and choice, they become the makers who change the world.
I just love John Spencer. He's got some great videos, and if you haven't had a chance to check him out, but the launch is often a great book. If you haven't seen the book, you'll want to check that out. So that is a type of project, is the launch method. There's all kinds of different methods. It's interesting when you think of project-based learning and you think of the elements of project-based learning. We've kind of talked about them. You saw two definitions that were kind of different, but one of the things that they like to talk about is the difference between projects and project-based learning. And it was interesting. I remember doing this workshop, and there was an administrator in the workshop, and when I defined the difference between project and project-based, this big light bulb went on, because they're like, oh, my son, he came home and he had this project he had to do. And I said, what did your teacher ask you to do? And he goes, not much. Because the difference between a project and a project based oftentimes is projects tend to come after the learning. They're great right now, this time of year, where we can provide some directions. It's typically done at home, away from schools. There's not much time in the classroom. It's usually a single end product, one thing that everybody's turned in. It's oftentimes what I like to call a recipe. I did it often when we would design houses in my classroom. Everybody had it in product. There was a house, but they looked differently. Some people made 1,800 square foot homes. Some people made 2,500 square foot homes. So the project in itself, that everybody had a house. Now, a project-based learning is when it's integrated in the learning itself. It's throughout the learning. It's driven by student inquiry, and it typically is given time in class to collaborate and work and brainstorm and ask new questions, and the end products will vary. So it could be a video, a poster, or whatever. It looks a little bit different. So that's the difference between projects oftentimes coming after, and project base is oftentimes coming through the learning. Now, I say project-based learning, but there's lots of different types of learning-based projects that you can be, because remember, we talked about it's really constructivism, where we're asking the learner to construct or make their own knowledge rather than just passively receive information. We can call it project-based, inquiry-based, challenge-based, discovery-based, game-based, brain-based. They're all constructivism type projects where we're really asking the students to construct or make their own knowledge. So don't worry about if it's a project or a project-based as you're going through this. Just think about, how can I extend the learning? How can I get the kids to think about open-ended questions? So instead of asking about if a person earns $25,000 a year, how long will it take until they have $1 million? Ask your kids, what does it mean to be rich? That is an open-ended question, right? Instead of in science asking what is an atom, which is very Googleable, why don't we ask them, well, how does that discovery of the atom impacted science? And if you're in a literacy, instead of asking what your favorite character in the book was, why don't we ask them how they feel about all the characters in the book? Or the Bill of Rights, instead of what it is, how has it, granted or denied freedoms? Oh, I love this last one here. Instead of asking the colors of the rainbow, ask them to describe to someone who is blind, what are the colors of the rainbow? These are open-ended questions. This is where we can really get our students brainstorming and thinking. And that's what we really want them to do. We want them to, suffer through the thinking. Really, when you think about it, we want them to have grit. We want them to have guts, resilience, integrity, tenacity. And this rubric is, guys, in the Canvas course. But it's a great way for students to not only reflect and think on their learning process, but helping them understand that they have to take risks, that they have to be courage, that they have to be persistent and tough, and being open with their peers and their partners in their groups, and being committed and forward thinking. This is a great rubric to help students not only evaluate the product, because we can do a different rubric for that, but this is to evaluate the learning as they go through the product. So again, this is in the Canvas course. The other thing that I'm big on is when you do products is giving them rubrics. Now you can design rubrics with your students, or you can have the rubrics readily available at the end. I've recently become a big fan of the single point rubric that says, this is the one thing I want you guys to get to. I can use star ratings and I can have reflections, or I can do the glows and grows where I have, the criteria down the middle of the chart, as you see here, and I can give them responses back about where they glow and where they can grow. So also the nice thing about these single point rubrics is it doesn't just give information back from the teacher. You can have them evaluate each other's projects this way, so then they can critique and reflect and come up with a better product down the line. So single rubrics, they're also in the Canvas course. You can see that. The key here is to get students to ask questions. We want them to brainstorm. We want them to write down all the questions that they have. Don't think about answering them but just think about what questions they already have. And even if they have a statement, we'll turn it into a question. So here's an example. Here's our driving question, right? How do we achieve lasting peace in the Middle East? So you can see over there all the different color Post-its that came together that students can just brainstorming. They just threw it up. They could have used a Padlet. They could have used a Jamboard. The kids were just throwing up some of the questions, like how long has there been drama in the East? How is oil the issue? Is it sustainable? What's caused some of the recent revolutions? I heard that it has to do with religion. Just having them brainstorm these, and then that helps them use that constructivism, that inquiry process to develop their own learning. what's going to happen now is inside of our Canvas course, this is the opportunity for you to go ahead and go in and develop a project if you'd like to do that over. I know it's short because we're at the end of the school year. Matter of fact, I'm thinking in the next 2 workshops, we'll just develop lessons. I know we can't implement them, so those will be fun. We'll do some 4C lessons and some 5Es. Those are the ones that are in June. But I'd like you to explore some of the project-based samples that are already in there. There's some great ones from PBL Works. I think we have some others in there as well. You could either take a project that you've done in the past, remix it, try it again. We're at a great point and opportunity where you can do review with the kids and preparing them for some finals or some end of year, where you've got a little bit of time to do that. There's lots of stuff in the extended Canvas course to get you going. Remember, inside the Canvas course, there's the Learn page, where you can learn a little bit more about project-based learning. There's the Grow page, where it talks about how to grow it in your classroom, and you'll see some videos on there on inquiry based, as well as the launch process and different things there. And then the show is where you show off, where you do it in your classroom, you reflect on that learning, throw in a couple of artifacts from doing in your classroom and showing it off.